But I think one of the most important things is like, what is the core strength of this company? And is that core strength exceptional? And if it is, then the weaknesses can be dealt with, I think.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's episode, we have Zach Williamson, co-founder and CEO of Aztec. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast, where we do snapshots with interesting founders from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with Zach at Aztec. All right, hey everybody, I'm here today with Zach Williamson, co-founder and CEO of Aztec. Zach, how's it going today?
Hey Tanner, it's going great. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much for the time. I'm really pumped to chat, and I know we've got a ton of really cool stuff to talk about. So let's just jump in. Maybe to start, could you just tell us a little bit about your story, and especially from your very interesting background, like what got you interested in crypto, blockchains, ZK technology? Give us that kind of rundown.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did I get into space? Oh man, it feels like a long time ago. It was six years ago, which in this industry makes me a bit of a dinosaur, I think. So how did I get into this? I'm not a cryptographer, not formally at least. I am a particle physics refugee. Originally, I did a PhD. I wanted to be an academic, had these rather grand aspirations based around, somewhat idealistic views of what academia is like and what doing fundamental research is. Anyway, so I crashed out of that, but I enjoyed programming. I was good at software engineering, so I started doing that for a couple of years. And then I met Tom, who at the time we became co-founders of a Web3 startup. So my introduction to this space is very ad hoc, I guess you could say, just serendipitous. So Tom was a friend of my brother's, so like weird connections. But basically, he'd worked in the city of London. He had rather deep domain knowledge in finance, and he wanted to use Web3 to create some TradFi products that could cut out a few middlemen. Use decentralization to make things more efficient. And I was at a loose end of it, looking for something interesting to do. So I'm like, yeah, sounds like fun. I at the time, this was 2017, so Chain did not have the best reputation. I mean, it doesn't now, but it didn't back then either, because it was height of the ICO boom. And what interested me about Tom's idea is it actually looked like it was a useful application of the tech. It wasn't just some token pump and dump. And I liked the concept of distributed systems. So I was like, hell yeah, let's do this. We needed privacy for the application we were building. At the time, the company wasn't Aztec. It was called Credit Mint, because we minted credit on chain. Yeah, anyway, so we needed privacy because, if you've got these portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars, it's a little bit of a commercial disadvantage if your competitors can see what you're doing. And at the time, we were very ignorant about how blockchains worked. We were thinking, we can just get, privacy by obfuscating transactions, just like split up large transactions into lots of smaller ones. It'll be fine. It wasn't fine. It's, as we didn't yet realize back then, that as in we, as in me and Tom, that it's trivially easy to trace those kinds of transactions. So we kind of had a come to Jesus moment at the end of 2018, where we realized we needed strong privacy guarantees for our startup to survive. And the only way of getting that was through this weird, arcane field of knowledge called zero-knowledge cryptography. So I spent the winter of 2018 basically trying to figure out what the hell a ZK snark is and seeing if we could port some of the existing tech that existed out there, things like Zcash, the zero-coin protocol, to Ethereum to keep our startup alive. And that was really the start of how I got into cryptography and privacy and all the stuff that Aztec does today.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so back in 2017, very different world in this space, right? And so I'm curious, it sounds like the problem you were aiming to solve was fairly clear back then and how that matured into kind of the knowledge that maybe formed the basis of Aztec. But I'm curious, how has your understanding of the problem space evolved as the space and technology has matured over the last 6 years?
How has the problem space evolved? So I think back in the day, it was quite clear what you could use blockchain for, as in the potential of it, but there's a lot of naivety around the quality of the technology in terms of the tooling, ease of building and deploying applications. So you had the concept of DeFi just about, MakerDAOs kicking around. You had the concept of things like decentralized identity. You had the concept of real world assets, like, the idea you could create digital representations of, actual things like houses and property and shipping receipts and things like that. And so I think, and like 2017, you had CryptoKitties. So you started to have, the concept of an NFT and what it was. So I feel like the various components of what became the blockchain landscape in 2023 they had already been largely like understood by a few people in 2017. The problem was bringing them to market. I guess, although maybe that's too reductive. What else has changed? I mean, so the sophistication and complexity of the blockchain, of what you can do on chain, has changed, but the fundamental value proposition of a distributed ledger hasn't really. In that anything you could do with a blockchain in 2023, you could have in theory done in 2017. It just would have been a heck of a lot harder and possibly not as scalable. So yeah, I think just its scale that's really changed. You know, back in the day, sorry, let me mute my notifications. Back in the day, you really had to chew glass to deploy anything into production. You know, the tooling was so bad. You had these rather old versions of Solidity by modern standards where the landscape of bugs and vulnerabilities hadn't really been fully explored. And, you know, you didn't have nice development frameworks that allowed you to easily, you know, like do simple things like integration tests with your smart contracts and the rest of your application. So everything was much more manual than it is today. And even today, it's a lot more like the quality of the tooling is extremely, I would say, poor or immature relative to, you know, more established programming environments and languages. But it's a heck of a lot better than it was in 2017. So I think, yes, a lot of it is just a question of scale, to be honest.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay, so before we get too far ahead, can you just kind of in your own words tell us, what is Aztec? What are you guys building over there?
What are we building? Yes, so we are a privacy LT. So a layer 2 on Ethereum. So we're going to be inheriting Ethereum's consensus, but we will be our own independent network that constructs, you know, you send transactions to the Aztec network, you can compute blocks, those blocks get sent to Ethereum to be processed. So ideally the cost of transactions on Aztec is much lower, but the unique value proposition of Aztec is that you have privacy by default. And by that, I mean, you have encrypted state on Aztec, as in you can construct an end-to-end encrypted blockchain transaction where you have a ledger that controls things like, you know, balances, identities, etc., whatever you want. It's completely programmable, but you can encrypt that information, and only people with decryption keys can modify it, and nobody observing the network can see when those modifications happen. Maybe to bring that down up to something a higher level, there's three kinds of privacy on chain, really. The triptych of privacy. There's data privacy, user privacy, and code privacy. Data privacy means that any changes to your smart contract state you make can't be seen by observers. So if I'm changing my balances, my token balances, or, you know, I'm changing some like liquidity and liquidity pool, etc., data privacy is when you can't see what those changes are. User privacy is when you don't know the identities of the users who are sending transactions. And code privacy is where you don't know the smart contract that a user is transacting with either. And so Aztec is going to have all three of those privacy properties within our network.
Fascinating. Okay. So, you know, my understanding, Aztec's not a ZK EVM, nor is it ZK EVM compatible. And it also created its own programming language, Noir. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, we did.
I'm so curious about this. So some of the thinking behind those decisions, like what went into that thinking, what went into those decisions? Yeah.
So it kind of, when you start to think about how to construct private blockchains, not going down the ZK EVM route really is, it's quite implicit, because the EVM is not privacy compatible, as in the virtual machine it's just a regular, you know, abstract high-level virtual machine where you can. The difficulty with privacy is that the state model of your blockchain fundamentally changes. And what do I mean by that? So imagine you have Ethereum, but you use zero-knowledge proofs to encrypt everything. So now you have a ledger that describes everything in Ethereum, but it's all encrypted. Does that give you privacy? No. And that's because Ethereum is still at its core a key value database. And as in, you know, you have an Ethereum account and there's going to be entries in a database that are linked to your account. And if you encrypt everything, sure, people don't know what the account address is. They don't know the values of the, you know, the state associated with it. But if you start sending transactions, then, and that change your balance, the same entry in that database is going to change. So even if you don't see what the values are because everything's encrypted, you can still see the encrypted numbers changing. And so you can use that information to build up the transaction graph of who's transacting with you. All it really changes is that instead of your identity being your smart contract address, your identity just is the encryption of your smart contract address, which doesn't help you. To get true anonymity, you need to change the state model to one that looks a little bit more like Bitcoin and its concept of unspent transaction objects, where state is atomic. The idea is you have like notes that hold some kind of value, some as in numeric value, and they're owned by individuals, they're owned by accounts, and they're encrypted. And what can you do with UTXO? You can either create them or you can destroy them. And you can use zero-knowledge proofs and zero-knowledge cryptography to hide the act of destroying a note, so that if I own a note and I destroy it, nobody can see that I've destroyed my note, but I'm no longer able to use it on the network. That kind of implicit UTXO state model does not map to what Ethereum does, which means you cannot get strong privacy guarantees by turning the EVM into a SNARK using ZK. Therefore, we cannot build a ZK VM and get the privacy properties we desire.
Got it. Okay, fascinating. So, from this foundation, just kind of quick introduction of, what you guys are building, what you guys are up to. I'm curious to talk about maybe implications and also really like possibilities where, as you think about what's being made possible in the world based on what you guys are creating, how do you think about that? What stands out to you as most interesting or as most exciting?
Yeah, definitely. Because I've been speaking in very abstract terms, like what is private state useful for? So there are two things that I think privacy is a kind of a required feature for when it comes to potentially killer apps. And that's payments and identity. Here's my thesis around what are some of the fundamental limitations of blockchain and Web3 today. If you think about the original vision of the Bitcoin and Ethereum, the idea was to recreate how we interact with money. So instead of having these vertically integrated centralized entities that we have to trust to act as intermediaries whenever we transact, the idea is that you can recreate the world's financial system, but one where everything is more decentralized and composable. So you have this concept of a global ledger, this world computer, where you can construct these digital assets that are implicitly can interact with the existing universe of digital assets on that world computer. It's a game-changing idea because if you can pull it off, it means that assets start to look and act a lot like money. Because if you have right now, if you have a mortgage, it's probably sitting in a filing cabinet in the basement of some regional bank somewhere. It's not a liquid asset. Maybe your bank can package it up with a lot of other mortgages they have and create some kind of derivative that they can then, get graded by some rating agency and then sell it off to some poor schmuck or some poor pension fund. But then by doing that, they've obfuscated a lot of the information about that asset, and they've created a lot of systematic risk. If instead you actually have on-chain digital representations of every asset on the world in a way that you can program how they transact and interact with one another, then you need you start to not really need as much liquidity in your financial system in order to transact, because the fungibility of your assets actually starts to make them look and act a lot more like money. And that, if you can pull that off, massively reduces the amount of liquidity you need in your financial system. And if you need less liquidity in your financial system, then you need a lot less leverage. The entire basically reason for existence of banks as they are today is to create leverage. They take a small amount of deposits, a small amount of equity from savers, and they then create lots of leverage on top of that. They borrow from one side and then they lend out to the other on the other side. And the idea is that as long as there's a balance and there's not a bank run, everything's fine. But as history has shown time and time again, everything is not fine.
Sure.
If you remove the need for leverage by increasing the fungibility of assets, you remove the fundamental need for large centralized banks in the first place. And you can de-risk the entire economy. You can massively lower the barriers to entry of providing financial services, such that you can take the people working within financial institutions today and they can start their own little startups or syndicates and start to actually just directly produce more almost like artisanal financial services using a blockchain. And that was part of one of the parts of the vision of Web3 that has clearly failed to materialize. So going back to what I was asking before, what's the limitations of blockchain today? The only fundamental value on blockchains comes from the value of the native consensus token of that network, or from dollar-backed stablecoins. If the price of Ethereum went to zero tomorrow, every single token on Ethereum, its price would go to zero, except for USDC and USDT. And whilst that remains the case, you're never going to have a financial revolution where Web3 becomes mainstream and is starting to be used as infrastructure in everybody's daily lives. You really need real-world assets on-chain to do that. And to get real-world assets on-chain, you need identity. You need to be able to meaningfully link ownership of an asset to not just to an Ethereum address, but to a human being or to an institution or to a group of individuals. And how on earth are you going to do that if you don't have privacy? how consider the enormous amounts of risks that you would be taking, particularly if you're living in a country without a strong rule of law or strong institutions, as you can find in many parts of the developing world. And consider the fundamental difficulties that lack of privacy creates. It doesn't allow Web3 to compete on a level playing field with existing financial services or with Web2, because so many of the products and services we use in our lives that you could make more efficient with a blockchain, users require and expect privacy by default. Imagine if you could create a payments network on Web3 which was fast enough to support microtransactions. So you could use it to pay 10 cents. That would be revolutionary by itself. I mean, it could potentially go a long way to actually fixing some of the issues we have with the internet. For example, right now, the only viable way of monetizing internet content really is advertising. And has led to so many negative consequences because users, or at least the consumers, they're not users, they're products. And what web applications really care about is retaining your attention so they can mine you for commoditizable information. And that does not necessarily align with the interests of the user. You could create an alternative way of monetizing content through microtransactions. Imagine if, for example, take this blog. Imagine this was your revenue stream. And instead of having a subscription model or an advertising model, if people went to your podcast, a pop-up just turned up which said, "You want to listen to this? Click here to pay 10 cents. They click, and you instantly just settle a transaction on a distributed ledger through a web wallet that's baked into your browser. Effectively, it's Apple Pay for the internet, but fully decentralized and not owned by a first party. That would be revolutionary. You can't do that today with networks like Visa and MasterCard because the charges are far too high. However, even if you could get Web3 to scale to the point where that was practical, and you could settle those payments in stable coins and not ETH, the lack of privacy is a rather large deal. Imagine if every payment you made through Amazon, anyone could see, literally anyone. And anyway, yeah, I've been rambling a lot. I have more to say. But, yeah.
No, it's fascinating. It's really, really interesting how this all connects kind of in your vision of how this all works and the importance. And it's all exactly relevant to what we were talking about. So, maybe one last question on Aztec before maybe transitioning to just some curiosities I have about your views on the space right now. And this last question would be, every early stage project, right? You're going to run into challenges. That's surprising to no one, right? What's been really illuminating on this podcast is just hearing how folks have dealt with maybe one or two early challenges, how their team went about solving for those and what they were, how they thought about them. I'm curious how for Aztec, because it's what you're doing is, especially over the past year, has only grown in importance, I would imagine, from your vantage point, since the beginning, right? It's become more apparent what you're doing is so important. But I'm curious, during those early years that maybe it wasn't as apparent, what were you guys thinking through? What were you guys having to solve?
What were we thinking through? That's a very interesting question, because there's what we were thinking through at the time, and there's what we probably should have been thinking through. One of the early challenges that I think is really common with all startups is hiring, because it's very hard to hire good people if nobody knows about you. And in hindsight, we lucked out immensely with some of our early key hires. We found somebody through a recruiter who was absolutely amazing, like a senior engineer called Layla, who the reason she hadn't been snapped up by her personal networks is because she was looking to move country, so she didn't have a network here. So we found her through a recruiter. We found our Charlie, who's now our CTO. We found him through Reddit. Just complete blind luck. We've not hired anyone else through Reddit. But I think establishing legitimacy, establishing that you have something unique about your startup. It's not just that you're ticking all the boxes. As in, if you think about an early stage startup, there's kind of a roll call of things that they need to have got on top of to be a prospect. Do they have a good go-to-market? What's their business strategy? What's their technology stack? What's their organization like? What's their burn? What's their runway? But I think one of the most important things is what is the core strength of this company, and is that core strength exceptional? And if it is, then the weaknesses can be dealt with, I think. So Aztec's core strength, I think, was twofold. One of it was performing very difficult research and developments to actually to not just turn cryptography protocols into software, but to perform that research, actually identify the problems that needed to be solved and solve them in math and then implement that math. And the other core strength that we have is taking that kind of esoteric research and actually converting it into products that are approachable to users, to developers, like creating those abstraction layers that kind of hide away all the complexity. I think, at least I'm very biased, but I think those are our two core strengths, and we play to them relentlessly. And when it comes to the weaknesses, you try and find good people that can shore them up, but you don't focus too much attention on it. Personally, for example, I'm the CEO of Aztec, but if you think about the traditional responsibilities of a CEO, a lots of working on company organization, like how the company is structured, how making sure like the kind of the day-to-day constant interaction with your teammates, with the entire like organizational structure to check that everything is working well. I'm not the best at that, to be completely upfront. I have ADHD. I can barely organize my way out of a paper bag, let alone organize a company. So I don't. I have my co-founder, Joe, who is incredible. He's company president, who does an enormous amount of that. We have a fantastic COO, Lisa, who is also taking on that challenge. It allows me to focus on my key strengths, which is, technical architecture, cryptography, research, that kind of thing. So yeah, I guess going back to your original question, what are some of the key challenges? It's like finding an organizational structure where everybody can play to their strengths. It's very hard when you're small. It becomes a little easier when you've established some legitimacy and you can hire in people more easily.
Yeah, fascinating. I really appreciate the depth of your answer there. So maybe 3 last questions for you here, Zach. Mm-hmm. First question, and this is still just kind of about the space more broadly. If I were to say the future of Web3 is blank, how would you fill in the future of Web3?
The future of Web3 is going mainstream, I think. As in, we need to get Web3 to a point where it can be used as an infrastructure layer that is powering an enormous amount of the goods and services that individuals are interacting with without those individuals even realizing it. I think a bit like how, so right now, this podcast, obviously it's going through the internet, but like how familiar are you, how familiar am I with like the TCP IP protocol like that and the message switching protocols that actually enable that? We're not, right. We don't care. I feel like the blockchain transactions, Web3 transactions have to take that same role. And that's only going to happen if we can solve the issues around scaling transaction throughput and adding strong privacy guarantees, in my opinion.
Love it. Okay. So second to last question here. I'm curious if you could look back and maybe impart some advice to yourself back in 2017, getting Aztec off the ground, with an eye towards kind of how do you deliver or how do you share kind of your most generalizable advice to founders building right now? If you wanted to make sure that they knew what you know now, what would you go about sharing?
I mean, there's lots of things I could share around, like how do you organize your team, or how should you go about fundraising? How much should you raise? How much equity should you be giving away at each round? Blah, blah, blah. But that's all by the by. That's not going to really define whether you succeed or fail. It's just going to mean that if you do succeed, you'll succeed more. Let's win more advice. I guess at the risk of this being really superficial, I guess that my advice would really just be keep going. Being a founder in a startup, or just working in an early stage startup at all, can be a very difficult and demoralizing experience because you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you're building, you don't know how to build it. And there's nobody you can really go to for advice generally, because if your startup if you've got a good idea that's worth something, then there's a good chance that you can't solve the problems that you're dealing with Google search. And I certainly know, looking back in my past, I had a spectacular amount of naivety when it came to what we were trying to do. I dramatically underestimated the difficulties of what we're trying to do and how long it would take to implement solutions. And if I had actually known how tall the mountain was to climb, I wouldn't have climbed it. I would have been intimidated out of it.
Yeah.
But I think one of the issues with industries is as they mature, the scope of the problem space becomes a little bit more self-evident. So people just starting up, they have more information, they have more context around the scale of the problems, more than we did in 2017. And so I guess even if the problems are utterly daunting, just like the worst thing you can do is to be intimidated by that, because, there's anything worth doing is intrinsically hard, I think, or would have been already done before.
Love it. Zach, can you tell us what your team's working on right now and what the best way for people to follow along on the journey is?
Absolutely. So we are building the Aztec network, which is, we are hopefully within between 2 to 4 weeks, launching the Aztec Sandbox, which is going to be a local developer network, a local developer version of the Aztec network. You'll be able to write smart contracts in our programming language Noir, deploy them to a local testnet, publish blocks and transactions, basically run through the entire process of building and deploying and testing a DApp. If you're a developer or you like to tinker around with that kind of stuff, we would love your input and advice and thoughts. So you can find us at Aztec.network. That has links to all of our material or documentation, our GitHub, etc., etc. Also, Noir, even if you're not at all interested in what we're doing as a layer 2, Noir is a general purpose programming language that takes this a high-level program and will compile it down to a ZK SNARK circuit and a verification contract you can deploy to Ethereum or any other EVM network. So if you have some kind of application that or some kind of DApp that needs privacy today, you can get it by writing your application or parts of it in Noir. That's already, it's live. You can work with it today. You can deploy today. So that's at Noirlang. You can also find a link to it on our website. So yeah, feel free to tinker around with that. And yeah, follow us on Twitter. We have a discourse with all of our updates and internal musings around our architecture because we like to develop in the open. So yeah, feel free to head over to that and join the conversation.
Amazing. Zach, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of some of your replies here. And truly, I just can't wait to continue watching all the exciting stuff coming out of Aztec. So all the best in the continued good work. And thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot, Tanner. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. Take care.